Hi everyone, and welcome to our August edition of our National Sewing Circle live event with Nicki LaFoille. She's once again here to answer all of your sewing questions. So hi Nicki, thanks for being here.
Hi, glad to be back.
And we're going to start right off with a question that was just submitted. And this comes from Eileen, and she says, how do you sew with plastic? I've made a pouch for crochet items and I want to line it.
That's a good question. Plastic is maybe like a raincoat fabric or a shower curtain fabric, or laminated cotton even has that plastic feel on the top with like a cottony, flannelly back. So when sewing any of those fabrics, you kind of use the same principles, and those fabrics are great for lining things that you're going to put either foodstuffs in, so for making like reusable snack pouches, or makeup bags where things might spill and you want it to be easily wiped out. So when sewing them, you will want to keep in mind that kind of the same as when sewing leather, as soon as you make a hole in this fabric, it's there. You don't really have a lot of fabric forgiveness. So once you sew the seam, the holes are there. You can't, iron it. You can kind of finger press it open, but don't put any heat onto it, or it might melt. And a lot of times plastic might stick to the underside of your presser foot. That can be a problem sometimes. So you can get what's called a Teflon foot, or a PUL foot. Is that what it's sometimes called, actually?
Is it like a PTFE or something? Yeah, there's an acronym for it. Yeah, PTFE, I believe that's what it is.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Or sometimes called a Teflon foot. It's just got like a slippery underside to help the plastic slide under the presser foot. Or you can put a piece of Scotch tape on the underside of your presser foot, the kind that has that slippery surface to help it slide through, or a roller foot, or a walking foot. Roller foot would probably be better to help that roll through. So sewing with plastic, those are my main tips. Best of luck.
Absolutely, and of course, as I do every time, I have to point out that we have tons of videos on National Sewing Circle. We have a lot for sewing with oilcloth, laminated cottons, and tips for just working with those kind of fabrics too. So if you want more of a visual of all the things that Nicki just said, we have those on the website as well. All right, our next question here comes from David, and he says that he is indecisive when it comes to sewing knits. What is better, a French seam or an overlapping stitch?
When sewing with knits are really great and easy to work with because the edges don't ravel like woven fabrics do. So a lot of times I'll just use a regular seam, stitch it right sides together, and you don't really even have to finish the seam allowances. So it's not really necessary when sewing with knits to use a French seam or anything to try and encase those seam allowances, unless you want the inside to look really nice and pretty. But for raveling purposes, you can just stitch that seam, and you don't really have to do anything special with it. So that's what I always use. I just use a regular seam with knits.
Okay, and then as far as stitching with knits, though, there's a couple of different things, like your needles need to be different, right?
Yes, when you're sewing with knit fabric, you want to use a ballpoint needle. It just has more of a rounded tip so that it doesn't cut the fibers of the knit fabric and cause a run. So a ballpoint needle, you want to use all-purpose thread. If you use 100% cotton thread, your thread can sometimes break because it doesn't have as much stretch as an all-purpose thread does, because all-purpose thread is made of polyester, has a little more stretch. So when you're moving in your knit garment, the fabric has some stretch, so you want the thread to be able to stretch with it a little bit. And when sewing with knit fabric, if you are sewing a seam that needs to stretch, so the arm seam if it's got a stretch, or the neckline if you've got a stretch to go over your head, use a stretch stitch. So either a triple stretch stitch or a zigzag stitch, so that seam will have some give.
Perfect. All right. Our next question here comes from Mary Jane, and she says, "What is the best way to sew a separating zipper into a hand knit cardigan sweater?"
Good question. It's relatively easy, actually. You're going to want to hand stitch it, just to preserve that nice hand stitched or hand knit fat cardigan fabric. So I have a zipper here just to kind of help me show. It's not a separating zipper, but I like to have some props. So with your cardigan facing right side up, you can take your zipper and place it right side up. So place the opening of the cardigan right over the zipper tape with the edge of the knitting close to the teeth, but not so close that it'll get caught in the zipper when you're using it. And you'll want to place the zipper stop right at the bottom of the cardigan because we're going to fold the tails back, so place the stop right at the bottom. And you'll have your zipper the right size that you want it to be, so the pull will be right at the top, and we'll fold those down after we stitch the zipper in. So you've got your cardigan placed on top of the zipper, and so you'll want to hand stitch using a back stitch, and that is just for security. It holds a little bit better than just a running stitch. So back stitch just along like right next to the very edge column of your knit. So back stitch down, and after that's done, you'll want to probably stitch the outer zipper tape edge down, just kind of tack it down using a whip stitch around the edge so that's not flapping around, and fold these under and tack them down. You'll do the same thing on the other side, and that's all there is to it, really. It's pretty easy.
Absolutely. And I have to second the sewing it in by hand, because I've crocheted one and then spent all that time, and then you do it by the machine, and then you get all of these ripples because it stretches your knit or your crochet as it's going through the machine. So it doesn't look as good as if you take the time to hand sew it. So definitely a good tip.
And when you place the cardigan on top of the zipper, you'll want to pin it in place, but make sure everything is laying really flat, so that, like you said, you don't want to stretch that knit fabric as you're placing it along the zipper, because it'll get wobbly. So make sure everything is laying nice and flat, and I would definitely pin that cardigan onto the zipper first before you start stitching it.
Right. All right. Our next question here is from Cindy, and you'll probably be able to explain this. I'm not sure if you have a sample within reach to show us here, but she wants to know if you can explain and possibly show an example of an even weave fabric.
I don't think I could dig around, but I don't know if you'd be able to see it either. The weaves are a lot of times so small, but an even weave fabric, so I've got to look now. An even weave fabric is just a fabric where it's woven, the warp and the weft go over and under one thread at a time. So this is used a lot of times in just regular quilting cottons. It's not as strong of a weave as like a twill weave, which is used in denim jeans a lot of times, or in canvases. But it's if it's woven tightly, it's a really nice weave to work with. A lot of times burlap fabric. I know I have some in my drawer, but I won't rummage around for it. Burlap fabric, I think, a lot of times is an even weave fabric that's pretty easy to see the weave because it is so open. But it's just this is your warp and this is your weft. It's just one over, one under, one over, one under. Hopefully that makes some visual sense.
Perfect. All right, and it might be too, if you can actually pick up your fabric and do your best to look at it and sort of look really closely and see if you can see what she's talking about. Like she said, it'd be hard to kind of put that up to the camera and see if it was something that you could see. All right. Our next question here is from Jackie, and I'm interested to see if you can answer this one, Nikki. It says she just bought a new pattern, and one of the suggested fabrics is a sand-washed silk. I'm not familiar with this fabric. Can you describe it or compare it to another fabric?
Sand-washed silk. I gotta say, I've never heard of that.
I would
have to
I've
do
heard
a
of
Google.
Yeah, I've heard of washed silks. So, I mean, I don't know if this is just you actually wash it with sand and it gives it some sort of texture to it. But yeah, that's definitely a new one, and we're going to have to figure this out because I didn't think that there was a fabric out there that Nikki didn't know what it was. So now we're going to have to figure out what it is.
And I found my burlap, if you want to, maybe if Cindy can see that. That's an even weave, 1 over 1 under.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're gonna do some research on what sandwashed silk fabric is and see if we can answer that one a little later. All right. Our next question here is from Barb, and she says, "What is the perfect size for a baby receiving blanket?"
Baby receiving blankets. I don't think there's any standard size. The ones at Carter's, if you buy them at Carter's, they're 30 inches by 40 inches. But I've seen tutorials where they're like 39 inches square. I've seen tutorials where they're 31 inches by 36 inches. So anywhere in that general area, you'll have enough size for a receiving blanket, I think, for a baby blanket.
Perfect. And just because this was going to bother me until we figured it out, I have some information on our sand-washed silk. And it says sand washing is a process by which the silk is treated to give it an even softer surface texture, almost like the feel of suede.
Oh.
So that will be our fabric comparison for sand-washed silk.
Cool.
All right. Our next question here is from Rita. And she says, "My sewing machine gathers double thread underneath the plate, and my needle breaks pretty often. I'm new to sewing, so I suppose my mistakes are fairly obvious to you, but can you please explain why these things keep happening?"
That is a fairly common occurrence for sewing machines, a fairly common troubleshooting question that I get. So you'll get thread bunching up on the bottom for a number of reasons. So this is my checklist. Whenever something is going wrong with my thread or my tension, you want to start making sure your machine is clean. So getting lint anywhere in your machine can sometimes just throw things off. So even if your tension is weird, just cleaning out that machine can sometimes clear that up. So opening up your sewing machine, you want to brush out the moving parts gently. A lot of times people will use canned air and spray in, but I don't recommend that because sometimes that can push the lint further in. So either just use a gentle brush to brush that lint out, or you can use a canned air kind of at an angle and try and blow the lint out. You can also, you might want to clean out the tension dials at the top. You can do that by, they call it flossing the tension dials. So you can take a thread, or even some floss probably, open up your tension dials, so turn them all the way down to 1, and that'll open up the tension discs as far as they'll go. And just like you'd be flossing, floss those out, and sometimes you'll get like big bunches of lint, and you're like, oh, sure that's not good for it. I've done that. So floss those out, and make sure your needle is not dull. That'll cause a lot of problems with needle breakage. Make sure you're using the right thread weight. So if your thread in the bobbin is too thick in conjunction with a thick needle thread, because I know sometimes you'll use thick thread in the bobbin for like bobbin work, but that's used in conjunction with a lighter weight thread in the needle. So if you've got heavyweight thread in both parts, sometimes that's just too much thickness going on in those moving parts in the underside of your machine, and that can gunk things up and cause big thread nests. So make sure you've got the right thread weight, and make sure you've got the right bobbin. I've done this before. I have so many bobbins floating around. I don't even know why I have so many different kinds of bobbins. But if your bobbin is too tall or too short for your machine, sometimes the needle thread won't catch it, or will the bobbin thread will just get stuck in there if it's too tall. So make sure you're using the right bobbin for your machine to make sure everything runs smoothly. And as far as needle breakage, make sure you're not trying to sew through too thick of fabrics, especially if the needle is dull, or tightly woven fabrics like denim or any other twill weaves. If your needle is not sharp enough, sometimes it can't go through those tight weaves or many layers of fabric, and the needle will break. And let's see, a ballpoint needle will sometimes do that if you're using a ballpoint needle on many layers of woven fabric or tightly woven fabric, because the ballpoint needle has a slightly rounded tip instead of a sharp tip. So make sure you're using the right kind of needle as well. And hopefully after going through checking some of those things, you won't get as many thread nests or needle breakage anymore.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I know my number one thing is to just rethread my machine, because I have some machines that have like the little loop you need to go through right before the needle. Some of my machines don't have that, and so it's almost like turning off your computer and turning it back on. It just fixes my problem usually most of the time, so that's my go-to.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our next question here is from Amy, and she says, what is a good underlining fabric for wool trousers?
Underlining for wool trousers. I don't want to try to answer that because I am not entirely sure. I've never made wool trousers or tried to underline them, so I wouldn't want to give you the wrong answer.
I have to second that. I've never made wool trousers either. I can imagine, I mean, wool is pretty heavy, right? You might want something a little bit more lightweight, so you're not like really, really thick, heavy, super warm pants, unless that's what you're going for. Maybe just a standard lining fabric too you could use. We'll have to look into that too. Sorry, we haven't made any wool trousers before.
Yeah, sorry, Amy.
All right, our next one here is from Jeanette, and she says, what kind of elastic should I use to make fitted sheets?
Kind of elastic. I would use just a, kind of a narrow elastic, like a ½ inch probably. And I like using knit elastic rather than woven elastic. Woven elastic just seems really stiff and too firm. So something kind of narrow would probably give you the nice flexibility and stretchability that you want for a fitted sheet. I know they have a bazillion types of elastic at the fabric store, so it can be kind of overwhelming. But yeah, something that just if you touch them a lot of times too, you can just kind of tell what feel you would like. So just something flexible and with a lot of good stretch. So a lot of times the woven elastics that you use for like waistbands will have a really stiff stretch, and you wouldn't want that for a fitted sheet. So go play with the elastics and stretch them and see what feel you like.
Absolutely, and of course we have a video on National Sewing Circle on how to make fitted sheets. So if you are just thinking, I mean, maybe you've done it before and you're thinking about trying out different elastic, or if you haven't tried making your own fitted sheets before, we do have some step-by-step tutorials on how to do that. So again, I want to remind anyone who is maybe just tuning in that you can submit your questions for Nicki to answer live for about the next hour. You can do that underneath the video in the comment section. Just type your question and we'll work our way through as many as we can. And our next question here comes from Kathy, and she says, what is the top brand of sewing machines to buy?
That's another question that I get asked a lot, and it's a hard one because it's so subjective. People a lot of times, if their grandma used Bernina machines, they'll have that brand loyalty, and nothing will do but a Bernina. But I have used a lot of Pfaff machines and Singer machines and Husqvarna Viking machines, so they're easy for me to use because I'm familiar with them. But if I sewed a lot on a different kind of machine, I'm sure that would become easy for me as well. And a lot of the sewing machine companies have a ton of different models too. So from very basic, inexpensive models to very involved, expensive models with all the bells and whistles. So a lot of times it just takes a little bit of research to find what you're looking for, and going to a dealer to test drive machines is a really good idea to figure out what you like. So I can't say there's any top brand. It just depends on what you're looking for.
I agree, and I don't necessarily recommend this method, but this is what I just have one of each. I mean, and my husband doesn't really like it, but I've got at least, I have about 4 or 5 machines, all different brands, and they all have something about them that I like over another machine. So depending on the project I'm working on, I'll use that machine over another one. So that's always an option too.
If only we could all do that. Just get one of each.
All right. Our next question here comes from Rosemary, and she says, I always have a problem when connecting the tails on binding. They never fit. Is there an easy way to connect bindings?
Yes. I'll try to explain the technique that I always use. I don't actually connect the binding ends, though. I overlap. So when starting the binding, I'll start right at the very raw edge of the beginning and sew around, and when I get to the overlap point, I will cut my excess binding like 2 inches of overlap, and then fold that raw edge a 1/2 inch under, and then just overlap it over the binding beginning and finish stitching. So that's it's pretty easy. You do get that, that fold, so you can see that fold. A lot of times it's a little more noticeable than if you joined the ends. It's a quick and easy way to finish the binding. But if you wanted to join the ends, I just did a little quick thing here. So pretend, if you will, your binding beginning and this is your binding end. If you wanted to join them, when you start sewing the binding, start several inches from the end of the binding. So you're leaving this tail at the binding beginning, like 3-4 inches. You want to give yourself enough to manipulate when you're joining these ends. So there's your beginning, and then when you get to the end, you want to leave the same amount free at the end. So you have a tail at the beginning and at the end. And you'll cut the excess binding off so that you have an overlap. So if you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you want to have a 1 inch overlap so you'll have enough to stitch. So then you would fold this out of the way so that you just have your binding pieces. Align those short edges and stitch using your 1/2 inch seam allowance. Or whatever seam allowance you're using, you would double it and leave that amount of overlap. And then stitch that, and it will, then you can finish the binding, and it should fit, and that's another way to do it. Hopefully that made sense with my cobbled together example there. I know it's kind of hard to see with the camera like this, but
yeah, I think I mean either way works, either the overlapping or, like you said, just having the seam allowance. I know a lot of people, when they're doing bindings, when you stitch them together, you do it on the diagonal, so then you don't have that straight seam. You have one that's on the diagonal. So you do the exact same concept that you just said, but rather than cut whatever seam allowance you want, if your strip of fabric for your binding is, say, 2.5 inches to make your double fold French binding, then you overlap by 2.5 inches and go ahead and overlap them just like you would your diagonal, and then you can create the finished edge. And if you want a video on that one, I have to say I'm going to have to refer you to our sister site, nationalquiltercircle.com, and they have all sorts of binding-related videos, tons and tons of them. So definitely a resource you can check out there for binding. So a little bit of crossing over there, but definitely some great resources. All right. We have a comment here that I wanted to read because one of our viewers, Sheila, has answered our wool pants lining question. And she says that rayon is a great lining fabric for under wool, especially in pants. So thank you very much for sharing that, Sheila, and I hope that answers our previous question perfectly. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next question here is from Virginia, and she says, how often should you change your needle on both your sewing and embroidery machines?
So for your sewing machine, they say to change it after every 6 hours of sewing. I usually change it after every project. Or if it's like a couple of small projects, I'll do it after like 2 projects. But if you start to get skipped stitches or thread nests or thread breakage or anything like that, change your needle, and a lot of times that will help. And as for embroidery machines, and if you're sewing on fabric like fleece, that will dull your needle quicker, so you might want to change that. If you're like sewing a big fleece blanket, you might want to even change it in the middle of the project just to make sure you don't have any problems, because that fabric will dull your needle quicker. And for embroidery machines, since the needle pierces through the fabric so many times at such a fast rate, you're going through fabric and stabilizer. I would change that after maybe 2 embroidery designs, depending on if it's like an open red work or a line work design, you could go probably several. But if it's a very dense fill stitch design, I would change it after every design, just to be safe.
Yep.
You don't want, if you're embroidering, you definitely don't want your needle to break in the middle of a design, or your thread to break in the middle of a design. That is a pain.
Absolutely. Yep, I agree. I'm usually pretty bad about remembering to change my needle, just because I do lots of little tiny sewing projects. But definitely, I mean, if you have even one problem, you know, or like one of the checklist you were running through earlier about if you're having needle breakage and all of that stuff, definitely changing your needle should help with all those.
For sure.
Speaking of broken needles, we have a question here that says, where do the broken needle parts go in the sewing machine? I cannot find the parts of the needle. Will they destroy my machine?
That's tough. Sometimes if you break a needle and you can't find the broken part, it has flown off somewhere behind you or is on your floor. So be careful of that. Maybe run like a magnetic pin holder over your floor, see if you can find it. But if it has gone inside the machine, it's probably dropped down inside the throat plate. So take the throat plate off, open up the bobbin, everything, and maybe brush that out, see if it's in there. I'm inclined to say it wouldn't ruin your machine, just because the area that it would have to get into to mess with those moving parts is so small that I don't know that a needle part would be able to get in there. But a machine technician would probably slap me across the face for saying that. But that's just my inclination. So you can open everything up and sweep it out and see if you can find it. But otherwise, I would carry on and assume that it's.
Yeah, I think if it was making or causing a problem, you might be able to hear it, like if it was rubbing against the bobbin case or something. I recently went home and visited my parents, and I got to take apart the machine I actually learned to sew on 20 years ago, the one my mom sewed on for years and years. And we took the bottom off, and there was all sorts of parts of pins and needles, and they kind of really fell to the bottom of the case. Like, they weren't even touching any of the parts. They were just down in the case. So if they can drop all the way down to the bottom, they probably aren't going to cause any problems at all. Okay. Our next question here is from Chris, and she says, I'm a novice and just beginning to sew and quilt. How can I be sure that I am cutting my fabric the right way? And also, how do I know that I'm calculating correctly the yardage that I need for a project?
That's a good question. So for cutting fabric the right way, I'm assuming that means for the grain. So if you're making garments, they tell you want to keep the grain line running parallel to the selvage. So so the pieces will hang straight on the body, and when you're sewing your seams, if it's off grain, sometimes seams will hang, pull to the front or the back. I'll tell you a secret though. When I'm cutting out my garments, sometimes if I don't have enough fabric, I will cut on the crosswise grain. Assuming everything is equal, it's a solid color with no nap direction you have to take into account, or no directional print. The crosswise grain will be fine. As long as you're not getting on the bias and trying to connect a bias seam to a straight grain seam, the bias stretches. So if you try and connect those seams, you'll probably have a little bit extra at the bottom. You're like, oh no, what do I do? So parallel to the selvage or even perpendicular to the selvage sometimes is fine. And for quilts, I don't know how important cutting on the grain is for quilts. I'm not a quilter, really. I don't do a ton of quilting. But I would think the same kind of thing would apply. Lengthwise grain or crosswise grain would probably be fine cutting on. And you can see a lot of times in woven fabrics, you can trace, one thread to be able to tell if you're on the grain. Or just align it with the selvage, align an edge with the selvage to tell if you're on the grain. And as far as calculating yardage, if you're making garments, it should say on the back of the pattern envelope how much yardage you want for the project. If you have done your own pattern, like I do a lot of times, and you want to know how much yardage you need, I will lay out my pattern pieces that I've drawn on my floor and lay them out as I would lay them out on the fabric and measure it. So we know a yard is 36 inches, and woven fabric is most time 44 or 45 inches wide, so you can calculate it that way by measuring your pattern pieces. But for quilts, I actually Googled yardage for quilts, and there are yardage calculators that you can input your block measurements and how many blocks you're using for your particular quilt pattern, and it'll tell you how much fabric yardage you need. So I Googled yardage calculator fabric, and there's one on quiltbug.com. So you can find several resources for calculating yardage that way too. That's kind of cool.
Absolutely. And we have a follow-up question from Sheila on this topic, and she asks if you are not concerned about drape of fabric if you cut on the bias in a garment.
Yes. So yes, I would be concerned if you cut on the bias. Like I said, if you're trying to attach a seam that you cut one edge on the bias and one edge on a straight grain, that's going to give you problems. Your seam is going to twist. Your seam won't line up. So for seams that are joining, I would try and cut them on the straight grain, because once you get into the bias, if you cut both seams on the bias, and a lot of times for like A-line skirts, those will hang fine if each seam is cut on the same angle of bias. But I wouldn't try and connect a seam that's cut on the bias to a seam that's cut on the straight grain. And for straight grain going crosswise and straight grain going lengthwise, I haven't seen much difference. That was all I was trying to say with answering that previous question. So a seam that has one edge cut on the parallel to the selvage and one edge cut perpendicular to the selvage, as long as it's on the straight grain, I haven't seen much difference in trying to connect those seams, if that makes sense.
Perfect. All right, our next question here comes from Sarah, and she says, I have a hard time keeping my seams straight. Do you have any tips?
Yeah. So you can place a piece of tape along on your sewing machine in front of the needle and align your edge with that. Sometimes that will help keep seams straight. Ashley, do you have any other tips? I like that one. I use that one a lot.
I use that one too, and I started sewing garments, so I was just used to eyeballing kind of a 5/8 inch. And then when I started quilting, I could not get a 1/4 inch seam down, so I had to mark everything. I actually put my ruler and took my pencil and I marked every seam, and that made sure I was keeping everything nice and straight because I'm just following a line. So that's something that's a great way to sort of get yourself used to either where it needs to line up on your throat plate, where it needs to line up on your presser foot, whatever it is that helps you get that seam straight. So that's a good one too. All right, our next question here comes from Tarina, and she says, do you free embroider or is everything computerized? I have free stitched, but it is not very easy with my machine. I have the same machine that is behind you. I have resorted back to hand embroidery.
All right. I didn't know you could see that, but cool. Yes, I actually, I do not like Freemotion embroider, but you can. You definitely can. You can lower the feed dogs, put on a Freemotion foot or an open toe foot so you can see where you're going, and you can just kind of free move the fabric around. I'm sure you can do it with this machine. I haven't tried it, but most machines have that option where you can lower the feed dogs and have, I don't know if a foot is included with the machine, like an open toe foot or a Freemotion foot, but you can definitely buy feet for any brand. They usually offer a ton of different feet. But also, with this machine, there are a ton of built-in stitches, built-in decorative stitches, and I use that a lot of times. I will combine lines to do, it's not exactly embroidery, it's just decorative stitching, but if you do, line after line, it looks kind of like an embroidery design. So I've done that a lot as like a faux embroidery.
Perfect. I have to say, embroidery is definitely your topic. I have one that's computerized, and I know how to press go, and that's all I know how to embroider. So, but if you guys are trying, free embroidering, I'm impressed because that's got to be some tricky work. So.
Yeah, you can. You could probably also. I'm conjecturing here. I've never tried it, but you can. You could draw your design onto your fabric using chalk or removable marker. And you could stitch over pretty much any design you draw, but it would be just just a straight line, or you could do it in a zigzag stitch. But to get the fill stitch look, that's an embroidery machine specific thing.
Absolutely. We have another comment here. I think it's great that we're having viewers that are also commenting on the questions we have talked about previously. And so this is from Marlene, and this is regarding when we were talking about cutting out pattern pieces and cutting bias for quilts. And she says quilt cuts should be on grain. If they are cut on bias, they will stretch, and it may cause stretched or crooked seams, which is probably totally true. And I just want to point out, if you have, maybe you're really into sewing, but you also want to try out quilting, there is our sister site, National Quilter Circle, and you can get tons of information on that as well. But as far as sewing questions, we definitely want to encourage you to continue asking questions. We're going to keep working through them for another 20 minutes or so, so go ahead and enter those into the box below this video, and we're going to keep on going. So our next question is from Dee. And she says, when sewing with patterns, how do you choose the right size to cut? I normally wear a 12 in pants and an extra large in shirts. And so she needs help deciding what pattern size that is.
Yes. Thank you, Dee, for that question. That's also a fairly common question I get. So you want to take the measurements that are given on the pattern package. A lot of times it is, let me see, bust, waist, hip, and back waist length. So it's helpful if you have someone there to help measure you, because if you're trying to measure yourself, any movement can skew the measurement. So you want to kind of arms at your sides, and if you have someone to help you, that'd be great. If not, it's fine. It won't be off all that much. So your bust measurement you take right at your nipple line. Your waist is at your natural waist, usually at your navel or the narrowest part of your waist, and then your hip is at the widest part around your bottom. And your measurements are never going to be exactly what the sizes are on the patterns. So cut out the pattern size that is closest to your bust size. And if your bust size is between pattern sizes, go up, round up, because it's easier to take away size from a pattern than it is to add. Just from a pattern alteration standpoint, it's just a little bit quicker and easier. So cut out the size that corresponds to your bust size, and then trace a copy of that, and so you can preserve that tissue, that original tissue pattern for later use. So your traced copy that you traced on the butcher paper or craft paper, you can do all your markings too. So if you want to kind of blend sizes, you can do that. That gets into it some more. I wish I could show, do a whole thing, but yeah, I hope that answered the question. Cut out the size that corresponds to your bust size. I'll stop there. I know I'm rambling.
Well, and we do have, and I think you've even done a couple for us on how to make adjustments to pattern pieces, on how to alter patterns, and so those are on the site as well. You can just search for pattern alterations, and it kind of shows how to grade between pattern sizes up or down, and that will give you a better visual of everything that Nicki just explained. So if you want that, that's again on our website. Our next question here comes from Jacqueline, and she says, how do you make a bound buttonhole?
Ooh, this is a good question. So bound buttonholes are really cool. They're really neat and nifty, and they look fancy, but the technique is pretty easy to do once you learn it. So there are two basic ways to do a bound buttonhole. So you can, if you've ever done a double welt pocket, the technique is kind of the same, but a little easier because you don't have to deal with a pocket bag. So you can cut yourself welt strips, and you want to cut, so you'll cut a rectangle using your fabric, longer and wider than the welts need to be. The welts only need to be 1/8 of an inch. So, but you don't want to try and mess with fabric that tiny. So cut yourself a decent sized rectangle, a couple of inches wide, and however long you need to make all your welts at once. So fold the fabric in half with wrong sides together and stitch 1/8 of an inch from the fold all the way down, and then trim 1/8 of an inch from that stitching line. So your finished welt is only 1/4 inch, and then cut the welts as long as you need them to be. You'll want them to be, like a 1/2 inch, I think, wider than your button, so you have room to stitch them in to your buttonhole. So cut as many welts as you need, and so on your fabric you will have marked your buttonhole marking, and you want to place your welt on the right side of the fabric with the raw edge of the welt lining up with the buttonhole marking and centered on the buttonhole marking, and stitch along your previous stitching line. And then do the same thing with another welt, abutting those raw edges, and then stitch over that line. And then cut along the buttonhole line, and about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, you want to do a Y cut into the corners. And then you can push those welts to the wrong side of the fabric. And then the folded edges will meet at the center of the buttonhole. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it, you see I have these tabs open so that I can point you to. Threads Magazine actually has a good tutorial on that method of the bound buttonhole. It's threadsmagazine.com. You can enter in bound buttonhole in the search bar, and that'll come up. It's got good pictures. So the other technique, there's a good tutorial on the Colette Patterns Sew-Alongs website. So sewalongs.com. It's the sew-along for the Anise jacket. You can go to that website, sewalongs.com, click on Anise, and there'll be a section for bound buttonholes. So in that technique, you cut a rectangle several inches larger than the buttonhole. So like 3 inches by 3 inches is kind of a good place to start. And you will mark yourself along your buttonhole marking. You'll draw a little box around it. So an 1/8 inch above and an 1/8 inch below will have the box around the buttonhole marking. And draw the same marking on your rectangle of fabric, which will become your welts. And on the right side of the fabric, the main fabric, place that rectangle aligning the boxes you've drawn and stitch along the perimeter of that box. And then cut through that center buttonhole line like we did in the other technique. And then when you get to the corners, do your Y cuts. And then you can push that rectangle fabric through to the wrong side. And then to make the welts, you take that rectangle piece and you fold the upper edge down along the stitching line, and then fold the raw edge back up so that the fold becomes the welt. So you fold it back up so that the fold covers half of that window that you just made for the button. And stitch the edges, and you'll do the same thing on the bottom of the rectangle. Fold it up along the stitching line, then fold it back down to create that welt. And you'll want to, fold the outer edges of the rectangle up so that you'll see that triangle of fabric that you cut out doing your Y cuts, and you want to stitch that to the welts to keep everything secure. So I like that method because you don't have to mess with cutting yourself welt strips. And then, if you are so if you were doing this for a jacket, you'd want to line it to cover up all the stuff on the back side of that buttonhole. And to make the windows in your lining for the button to go through, you would do the same thing, just without the welt steps. So on your lining, mark your buttonhole, and then you could take a piece of interfacing as your rectangle, stitch around your buttonhole box, and push that through to the wrong side of the lining, and that will give you your window to align on the wrong side of the bound buttonholes for your button to go through. So for visuals, that was kind of a quickie answer, but for good pictures, go to that website that I mentioned, and that'll have some nice pictures for you.
Absolutely, and I don't know if we have a video showing the first technique, but I know we have a video showing the second technique with the box, again on our website, and it shows how to do that whole bound buttonhole technique. So yeah, for the first one, definitely go to, I don't think we have one of those yet. We might have to think about putting one of those up on our website. For the second one, we definitely have one. All right, our next question here comes from Pat, and she says, when fitting slacks, how do you fit a flat bottom?
That is a great question, Pat. I have that problem. And I haven't done it much. I do a lot of pattern alterations for design, like style lines. I don't do a ton for fitting, but to take in that excess fabric at the bottom, I think you, if it's just a little bit, you can take in at the crotch. So just cutting off, you've got your crotch seam curve, and then the inseam that goes down, you can just take off a little bit off of that seam. And I've done that before, to just take in a little bit of that. If you need to take in a lot more fabric, you will probably have to slash somewhere, but I wouldn't want to say exactly where because I'm not entirely sure. But if you type in your web browser search bar, pattern alterations for flat bottom, I think some good blog posts will come up because I know I've done that Google search before.
That's definitely an alteration I've never had to make, so I have no suggestions on that one.
Yeah.
All right, our next question here is from Debbie, and she says, what thread weight should I use for heirloom sewing on my serger?
That's a good question that I'm gonna have to bounce off as well, because I don't actually have or use a serger. I know for heirloom sewing on a sewing machine, you just want to use kind of a lighter weight thread to get that nice delicate look. I'm sure they have the serger equivalent, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
I'm wondering if, just a follow-up question to Debbie, if she's still watching, if you just mean on how to finish the edge of something you've already done heirloom stitching on. And in that case, it may not necessarily matter what weight of thread you're using unless you're really trying to match the stitching that you did. But if you're just trying to finish the edge of your project, then it may not matter as much as to what weight of thread you're actually using for that part. Our next question here is a good one that I think we could all use some help with. And it says, how do you schedule and prioritize your personal sewing projects?
That is a good question because I have a notebook full of sketches and lists. But I usually go by time, like if there is a deadline for something, if I'm sewing something for someone else and they need it by a certain deadline, or if I only have like a short time to enjoy the project. My daughter, you know, she's only going to fit in this shirt for like 2 weeks, so I need to sew it so that I can get my enjoyment out of it. I would do that first. But if it's something that I know I will use for a long, long time and get lots of enjoyment out of for years to come, that's not as much of a priority as something a little more timely. So that's the main criteria I use. Sometimes something just is grabbing at me and it won't let my brain go and I have to do it, so that'll jump the queue. But that's the system that I use, but it's probably different for everybody.
Probably, I absolutely have no system at all. Sometimes that's why I have so many that are started and not finished. But I definitely like the deadline one. That's definitely something that motivates people, is having a deadline to get something done.
Yeah.
All right, our next question here, and I know we've talked about this one before in the past, and Denise says, I'm a novice and starting to make my own patterns. What is the best book I can read and learn from?
Yeah, so I feel kind of like a sham doing this because this is the only pattern making or altering book that I have read. So I don't know, maybe for book reviews I go on Amazon and I would type in pattern making books, and you can find the top bestseller and read reviews on books. But this book I used in college, and it's this thick. It gives you instructions on how to make your own sloper, and then how to take that sloper and make a million different styles out of it. So this is the only book that I've ever used. So I'm gonna give that recommendation. Designing apparel through the flat pattern.
Perfect. Awesome. All right, our next question here comes from Patty, and she says, I would like to consider sewing my own bras. Do I need any special equipment, or can they be sewn on a standard sewing machine?
They can absolutely be sewn on a standard sewing machine. You don't need anything special in terms of machinery, but you will need some specialty materials. And for bra making, I go to Bravo Bella Bras, and that's Monica Bravo. She's the lingerie queen in my eyes. She has sewing workshops for bras that you can attend. No online instructions, unfortunately, but also on the curvysewingcollective.com, they have bra pattern recommendations for large busts. So that is a good resource. And then brawmakerssupply.com is a really good resource for buying kits and bundles for bra making patterns, fabrics, trims, elastics, cups, all of that, those specialty items that you will need as far as materials to construct the bra. That's a good resource to find, but you'll just need your sewing machine and some dedication, and making your own bra is definitely worth it. I have not tried it myself, but I've talked to a lot of people who have, and they're very glad that they did it. And since, you know, trying to buy a bra that fits you correctly, everyone knows is a nightmare. So I definitely applaud you for asking the question and encourage you to go for it.
Absolutely. All right, we got a follow-up question to our previous question, and Peggy wants to know, what is a sloper?
A sloper is just a basic block pattern. So a lot of times it will just be a what is this? Not a scoop neck, but a whatever this neckline is. Why am I drawing a blank? I went to college for this, but this neckline set in crew. Thank you, Peggy. I believe that is just a crew neck. Set in sleeves, it'll be a long sleeve, and you can make a sloper any style, just the basic building block for whatever patterns you make most. I know Berta Style actually sells slopers, like you know, A-line dress sloper or pencil dress sloper. So it's just like the most basic you can get. My sloper that I made in college, I have a pencil skirt sloper with 2 front darts and 2 back darts, and going from that basic pattern, I can make, you know, any skirt pattern that I want. So it's just the basic building block for all your patterns, and when you make that for yourself, you want to do it to your own measurements so that you know, everything's going to fit right, and the sky's the limit. After you get your sloper and some pattern alterations knowledge, you can take that and go in any direction you want.
Perfect. All right, we have time for a couple more questions here, and our next one says, I am looking for 10-inch by 10-inch pillow forms. Do you have any suggestions for online companies? I've checked at several fabric stores near me, but they don't seem to carry them.
Yes. So I kind of buy everything that I need for my household on Amazon.com because it's this huge marketplace. So search, I actually did a quick Google search on 10 by 10 pillow forms on Amazon, and some came up. But also there's a website called pillowcubes.com, and they have any size pillow form that you could want. So there's another resource.
Perfect. All right, one more question here, and this is from Matilda, and she says that her machine does not sew on very stretchy fabrics. Why is that?
So that depends on what you mean by doesn't sew on. Sometimes on very stretchy fabrics you'll get a lot of skipped stitches that makes it seem like you're not really sewing. That'll happen on spandex sometimes, or very slinky knits. And that's just happening either because you've got the wrong kind of needle, so make sure you are using a ballpoint needle. And if the fabric is really, really thin and slinky, sometimes the feed dogs just don't want to grab it. So you can sandwich your fabric layers in between some tissue paper to give the feed dogs a little bit more to grab onto. You can try spraying it with spray starch to stiffen it up a little bit, or even sandwich it between layers of tearaway stabilizer. I like to use that a lot. That just gives your feed dogs and your needle something to really grab onto. So that would be my place to start for that. But without seeing it, it's kind of hard to tell. But
and we've mentioned before the different needles and things like that you need for sewing with really stretchy fabrics as well too. So your ballpoint or jersey needles or things like that, right, can help.
Yes. Yep. A ballpoint needle is sometimes called a jersey needle or a stretch needle.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. Actually, we have time for one more here. So we have one from Joy, and she wants to know: is there an all-purpose sewing machine thread and sewing machine needle? I have a lot of trouble with thread breakage and needle breakage.
Yes, so there is an all-purpose thread and needle. So the all-purpose thread is basically just called all-purpose thread on the label in the store. It's just a polyester thread. So if you buy a thread that's labeled polyester, that's a lot of times a really good all-purpose thread to use for any sort of fabric. And your all-purpose needle will be called a universal needle, and that just means that the tip it's not rounded like a ballpoint, and it's not super sharp like a microtex needle or a leather needle. It's kind of in between, which makes it good for sewing on a wide array of fabrics from wovens, and you can sew on knits with it generally, and you can sew on most types of fabric with it. So that's a really good all-purpose universal needle to start with when you start sewing.
Absolutely, and of course I have to throw in that we have lots of videos about different types of needles, different types of thread. We even have a really great guide. It's an ultimate sewing machine guide that you can download on our website, information about your machine, as well as things like needles and thread. We have information on different sewing machine feet. So any question you have about any little accessory or anything you need for sewing, I guarantee you we have an article or a video or something with information about it on nationalsewingcircle.com. So definitely check it out. And I want to thank everybody for participating in our live event tonight, whether you pre-submitted questions or you asked questions or even gave us some follow-up and answered some of our questions for us tonight. I want to thank everyone for participating, and of course thank Nicki for being here. So thank you, Nicki.
Thank you, everyone.
And I hope everyone has a good night.